Hello, this is Jane again from empowermefirst.college, and welcome to the next lesson of the creative writing unit. Now, by this point, we've looked at features of literary writing, and in particular of features of narrative fiction and poetry, and we've looked at different styles and different genre of creative writing. And hopefully you're starting to feel ready to tackle the assignment that comes at the end of this unit, which is to write your own short story. So these are the things we'll look at in this unit. We'll start by outlining the task a little bit, look at formal aspects like how many words, that kind of thing. And then we'll go on to break the writing task down into a series of steps to make it seem more manageable. And first of all, we'll look at how to find inspiration for your story. Maybe you already have an idea of what you want to write about. Lucky you if you do. But if you don't, fear not. Don't worry, because there are lots of suggestions, lots of ways that you can start generating ideas and finding inspiration. Then we'll go on to think about how you might go about planning your story, and this all-important skill of showing and not telling, writing implicitly, we call it. So allowing your reader to kind of work out what a character is like by what they say and how they act, kind of as they would if they met this person, met a stranger in real life. So there'll be lots of practical tips and advice in this unit, but you'll also find that it returns to ideas that we've already talked about. We'll return, for example, to creative questions like how to bring a new perspective to an everyday situation, how to make something seem strange or intriguing, how to describe using rich detail, use language creatively. Okay, so what is the task? Well, you need to write a short story of around 1,500 to 2,500 words. That's our requirement. Traditionally, short stories are often around this length. They might be a bit longer. They can be 7,500, maybe even up to around 10,000 words. But we'll be looking for about 1,500 to 2,500. There'll be various steps before this. So, for example, we'll ask you to produce a mini saga, and perhaps we'll also ask you to produce a first line of a story in a plan and to submit them for peer feedback. But at the end, what we're looking for is a complete short story. So how do you go about writing a short story? Well, firstly, you need a central idea. You need some inspiration. Now, you could take this from your life, or perhaps from something that you've read, or potentially something that has happened to someone you know. Or it could just be an intriguing idea, or a paradox, a contradiction, a puzzle, or something that you would just like to talk about. But it's important to also consider your reader. It's great if you're motivated to tell the story. That's a good indication that the story is probably interesting and your reader will want to read it. But how sure can you be of that? You can never be 100% sure. Of course, we heard in Unit 1 that Anne Frank was far from confident that anyone would ever want to read the musings of a young girl, as she said. But you should at least ask yourself the question, will somebody want to read this? Then you need to plan your story. Will there be a conflict at the heart of it? Where will it be set? What will the characters be like? Will there be what we call a narrative arc? That means, will there be kind of slope, a build of tension, and then some kind of crisis, critical point, and then a kind of resolution to your story? Whatever your plan is, you should bear in mind that 1.5 to 2,500 words is not a lot. So you should be able to develop your idea and your story within that framework, within that length. Perhaps your story won't have a plot at all. Perhaps it will just focus on a strange encounter, something out of the ordinary that happens. Perhaps you just want to take your readers into some otherworldly or strange or fantastical setting. And you can do all of these things. These are all possible. As you're planning, you need to also think about pacing. You need to keep your reader's attention, but you don't want it to be this kind of breathless, breakneck rush to get to the final sentence. A good way of putting it is the quote at the bottom. That's from Edgar Allan Poe, who was a very well-known writer of short stories, Gothic short stories. We'll come back to him later. And he said, a short story must have a single mood. It should cohere, we'd say. It should all stick together. And every sentence must build towards it. So every sentence should be creating atmosphere, or perhaps moving the plot along, or perhaps telling us more about the characters, or more about the central strange paradox, contradiction, puzzle. And then a very important aspect is that you need to maintain the illusion. You need to take your readers into this little bubble that you create for them, this little fictional world that you create for them, or maybe it's autobiographical, maybe it's not fictional, but you need to take them there and keep them there. And a good way of doing this is to make sure that you show rather than tell. So use this implicit characterization. Let the readers work things out for themselves. Incorporate a lot of rich detail so that they can really picture the scene and use your language creatively. So now we come to the first step as you move towards writing your story, and that's deciding what you're going to write about and finding your main ideas and your inspiration. If you have an idea already, you can perhaps skip some of this, but if not, there are lots of ways that you can generate ideas. One would be to look around you, and props can be a good way of getting inspiration. So objects. If you look around you right now, wherever you are, can you see any objects that trigger ideas? It might be an object that's out of place, or it might be something from the natural world, a feather or something like that. It might be something from a different country, or a personal item that triggers memories, maybe a photo or a piece of jewelry, anything that starts your ideas flowing. You can also use pictures to generate ideas. And if you look at the two pictures on the slide here, on the top right, I know it's small and it's difficult to see, but this is a picture of a busy street in a city. And there are lots of characters, lots of people performing everyday tasks, or some of them are talking, or some are relaxing, or just staring into the distance. And you can look it up for yourself if you think it might be helpful. Jacob Lawrence Street to Mabari. And you could pick one of these characters and tell their story. Why are they there? What happens to them on this day? Perhaps something unusual happens to them and it sets their life on a different course. Or you could take two and tell the story of the relationship between them. In the second picture, you can see a funeral procession. Now, what's the story here? Who's died? Who's in that coffin? It looks small. Maybe it's a child. How did they die? Did they die of natural causes? What is their relationship to the other people in the picture? And you could tell a very interesting story using that for inspiration. Another way of generating ideas is to use your senses. Sorry, I lost my place there. So if you imagine a specific setting, it could be inside, outside, a busy railway station, your grandmother's house. What can you see? Close your eyes if you like. What can you see? What can you hear? Can you taste anything? Smell anything? Could you touch anything? Make a list of the words and the expressions that occur to you. Another way is to close your eyes and just listen to the sounds around you. Do they trigger any ideas? And we could also try a little experiment with some specific sounds. So I'm going to play you some sounds. Here comes the first, and you can just, if you like, you can note down some ideas, some words that occur to you. I'm not sure if you could identify that. Hopefully you could work out that was somebody writing on a blackboard with a piece of chalk. If you did work that out, maybe you wrote down chalk, school, teacher. If you didn't like school very much, maybe you wrote down boring. I don't know. Let's listen to another one. So if you worked out what that was, you might have written door, hinges, rusty, old house, spooky, something like that. And here's a final one. There are lots of sounds here actually, but see what ideas it generates. Okay, so this is very different. It's not culture anymore, it's nature, right? We're outside in a natural setting. There seems to be a lot of very diverse wildlife. Maybe you wrote savanna or jungle or something like that. If you like the great outdoors, if you like to be out in nature, maybe you wrote relaxing or peaceful. If you don't, maybe you wrote dangerous or something like that. Okay. Just a moment. So this kind of associative writing, right, where you just take a trigger and write down the words that occur to you, you can do that without sights and sounds and smells. You can do kind of word association. Or another possibility is just try picking up the closest book to you and opening it at a random page and then closing your eyes and putting your finger on the page. Then you write down that word, and then you can do the same again on a different page. Point to a word, write it down, and then see if you can make a story using those words for inspiration. It's a challenge. It might seem a little bit random, but it might give you a sense of what kind of story you would like to write. And it might turn into something great. Lots of stories are born just like that. They don't all come from some blinding flash of inspiration. It's more what the author makes of it, how they create this world out of words that makes a good short story. Another way of generating ideas is to think about genre. And we found out in Unit 1 that specific genre contain specific types of character or storyline. So if you think, for example, of a crime story, you might think of a detective, a police officer, a criminal, witnesses, a victim, of course, maybe a murder victim, maybe not. You might think of certain settings like a police station or a jail or a bank that's about to be robbed, or a getaway car or a dimly lit alley where somebody's about to be robbed, something like that. So you're very welcome. I mean, it's possible for you to just decide to write a certain type of story, use a certain genre and the conventions of that genre. However, you might want to use those conventions in some kind of interesting, unexpected or creative way. So you could give the story an ending that fits another genre entirely. You could write a classic fairy tale, but have a police officer come in at the end of it. Or you could rewrite a classic story from a different perspective. You could make Cinderella into a man. And this is what I mean by allusions. Allusions are references to a certain work within another work. So you allude to another work of fiction within a work. And classic or well-known stories allusions to classic and well-known stories can be a very good starting point. You could, for example, write about the events of Thank You, Ma'am by Langston Hughes. You read that last semester, from the perspective of the woman. She was called Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones. Don't be afraid to do that, to pick and mix elements of things that you've read and give a different twist to something that you've read. Tell the story from a different perspective, give it a different ending, and to be inventive. So once you have a general idea of what story you might like to write, you need to start fleshing out the ideas. That means giving them more shape. So beginning with your protagonist or your central characters, you need to think about what they're like. What do you need to know about them? You might need to know what they look like, who their parents are, what their childhood was like, what jobs they do. Depending on what happens to them in the story, you might want to know what strengths and weaknesses they have, what kind of personality they are, whether they have any secrets, whether how they present them is the same as how others see them. And just one strong idea there can write the entire story for you. There's a short story by a Russian author, Gogol, where it's called The Nose, and it's about a character who sees a very local, a person who's very important locally. He's a local politician, and suddenly one day he's turned into a nose. And this nose goes around and does everything that the politician would do. It's strange, but it's interesting. And he's saying a lot about how people have a public persona that's different from how they really are. To find out about your character, a good idea could be to put them on a hot seat. So that means you kind of interrogate them, ask them lots of questions, and write down what you think their answers would be. Of course, you will get to know your character as you are writing. You'll find that as you're going around your daily duties or whatever, walking around where you live, that the character is almost sort of next to you and you're thinking about them a lot. But it is a good idea to generate a lot of ideas and have a firm sense of who this person is before you start writing. Then think about your setting. Remember, you want to immerse your reader in the story. You want to make them feel like they are wherever the action is taking place. You want to take them there. If your setting is a real place, it might be worth doing some research so you can describe it in realistic detail. If it's a place from your imagination, maybe you want to draw a sketch of it first, or to collect adjectives or expressions you can use to describe it. Then you also need to think about plot. Many plots revolve around some central conflict. Coming of age stories, for example, often revolve around a conflict between the young person. They come into conflict with their family or with their community, something like that. And that's the start of the action. Will your story have a central conflict? Will it be an internal conflict where the character is fighting some inner demon or some aspect of themselves? Will it be a conflict between two characters? Will the character be in conflict with his or her community, as I said, or perhaps with nature? Perhaps they're at sea and they're fighting storms and tides and that kind of thing. Now, a short story doesn't necessarily need to have a central conflict. You might prefer to focus on a situation, and perhaps it's a situation, perhaps it's a setting from ordinary life, and then something out of the ordinary occurs and changes the usual routine. Some of the best short stories deal with strange encounters, for example, the Langston Hughes story, or some kind of puzzle, something illogical, what we call a paradox or a mystery. A good example here would be Toni Morrison's Recitative, where she talks about characters that are of different races, but she doesn't tell you what race they belong to until the end. So the reader is kind of trying to puzzle it out for themselves. Okay. On this slide, you can see there's a template for making notes about your story. Depending on what kind of story you decide to write, some of these boxes might need to be bigger and others might need to be smaller. So if your story has got this kind of classic arc with rising conflict, rising action, and then a crisis, and then an ending, then the part in the middle will be useful to you. But if you're just describing an unusual situation, that might not be as useful. If your story is very character driven, then the box on the bottom left will be useful, or if setting plays a big role, then the bottom right will be useful, and so on. You'll find this template on Moodle, and you can download it and use it, but perhaps just use it as a general guide, and bear in mind that certain boxes, certain parts of it might be more relevant than others, depending on your story. Now on to the all-important skill of showing rather than telling. If we look at the first example here, let's read it. Julie was very sad. She knew that she didn't have any friends. This made her feel terrible, and she hated going to school each day. She knew that Katie and Emma hated her most of all. She felt like hitting Emma. It was all Emma's fault, but she didn't know what to do about it. So here the narrator tells us precisely what Julie is feeling and thinking and why. If we go on to the next one, the next example. A tear, it's the same general situation, the same characters. A tear trickled down Julie's cheek. I'm not going to school, she told her mum. Oh, yes, you are, her mum replied. A bitter knot of resentment pulled at Julie's stomach as she tugged on her school uniform. Dashing the tears from her cheeks, she thought back to what had happened in the playground the day before. You're not playing with us, Katie said. You're not playing with us, Katie said. Emma was standing behind her, a twisted smile on her face. Julie clenched her fists hard, her fingernails biting into her palms, her head swimming with thoughts of revenge. So there you can see it's very different. We are not told precisely what Julie is thinking and feeling and why. We're given bits of dialogue. We're given descriptions of Julie's outward behaviour, how she pulls at her school uniform, for example, and how she dashes a tear from her cheek. And we're given a flashback, right, to the day before. You're not playing with us, Katie said. That's a flashback. And we're left to put together these pieces of the jigsaw ourselves and work out why Katie is sad. There's also a lot of metaphorical, figurative language, things like a bitter knot of resentment. Right? So there it's a lot closer to what we might do in real life, that we have to puzzle what somebody's inside is like and why they might be feeling like that. And that's a lot more interesting for us as readers than just being told exactly what to think. Okay, so what have we learned in this unit? Well, we found out all about the creative writing task. We've looked at the different steps in the creative process, how to generate ideas and how to plan the story, and then how to approach the actual writing in a way that interests and intrigues your reader. I hope you found it helpful and you're feeling a little more ready to try your first assignments, and I'll talk about those more in the next video. Goodbye.